Hello and welcome to another episode of the devlog of Runes of Aereal, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the battle interaction. So let's just start a sandbox here and talk you through what I actually mean. We're starting the battle, and when I talk about battle interaction, I mean the interaction here with these cards here. So the fact I can drag this up and let this go, it becomes a little bit highlighted, the blue lines across the cards, and then something happens. And sometimes I can let it go over an enemy like that, and then something happens to that enemy. And sometimes I can just drag it around and nothing happens and it gets dealt back into my cards here. So this is the interaction with these cards and how that is done in the game I'm going to show you now. So all of the interaction inside the battle is actually done in one single event sheet called interaction. And in that interaction event sheet, we've got actually a selection of different groups where we do interaction for the battle itself. We do some interaction for when we want to select a card, when we interact with the loot, or when we interact with scrolls. So these are all mutually exclusive. So either we're battling, or we're selecting something, or we're taking up some loot, or we're using scrolls, but not everything at the same time. So there's actually something going on where when we start the battle, these things here are disabled, and whenever we start the loot interaction, the battle interaction is disabled. So we can split this battle interaction, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Is actually, let's split this up into a dragging situation where we are dragging and dropping, where we're just hovering over cards and other things. The other things are really the simplest things. For example, when we click on the next turn button, we need to queue commands to end the turn. When we click on the scrolls button, we make a clicking sound and we pick the scrolls, and then we set the battle mode and stuff like that. Let's not go into that in detail here. I'll talk about a little bit about the battle mode when we go talking about the scrolls. And then finally here, when we click on the key button here, we need to show the menu. So in terms of dragging and hovering, this is the most important part here. So let's start with the hovering. So as you saw a few moments ago, when we hover over a card, the card becomes a little bit bigger, and when we stop hovering over a card, the card becomes smaller. So what we do actually, when a cursor is over a card, and this is a family, and the cards family is a family, of course, that contains all of the cards. And the cards instance variable called current deck equals T. That means that the card is on the table. So a current deck for a card can actually mean three things. Either it's the deck on the left, either it's the deck on the right, or it's the table. So let me just launch a sandbox again so I can show you properly. So there can be three locations for a card. This is the deck left, abbreviated in the current deck instance variable as DL. This is the deck right, abbreviated in the instance variable as DR. And this is the table, abbreviated as T. So whenever a card gets dealt here, the current deck equals T. When the card is discarded here, it becomes DR. When it is put here, it becomes DL. So that's how it works. So let's see. Whenever the card is on the table and the card isn't playing anything, so if it's tweening, that means that at this instance, when we are hovering over it, it's becoming larger or becoming smaller. we don't want a repeating action, constantly becoming larger, 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 because actually it's constantly executed this event. So we want to make sure that it's not tweening, that the variable called executing is 0, which means that there's actually nothing going on right now. So whenever a command is executed, this variable is set to 1, and at that time it shouldn't enlarge or diminish the size of the cards. And also it shouldn't be the card that is currently being dragged. This is the dragged UID. Once we start dragging a card, the UID of that card is being placed in this dragged UID, and if it is 0, that means there is no card being dragged. So only when there is no card being dragged, this will be executed. And also it should not enlarge when the cost of the card is it should only be executed when the card is lower or equal than the energy, meaning that if we don't have enough energy to play the card, it will also not fire this event. So then we pick the top instance, and that's important here because this event will pick all of the cards where the cursor is over at this time. But as the cards slightly overlap, as you see here, these cards overlap at a certain point. If we were to not execute this here, pick top instance, that would mean that we're actually going to enlarge both of them. And that's not a good idea. So that's why we pick this top instance. And we pick this top instance, and then we do two things. We enlarge all cards with parameter 0. We enlarge a single card with parameter 1. So this parameter is a Boolean parameter. Actually, it's a number, but I don't like to use Booleans in construct. That's just my own thing. If it's a Boolean value, I always use a number with 0 or 1. So the function enlarge all cards, let's go there, will actually pick all the cards that are on the table, except for a specific one, and then for each of them call enlarge card with enlarge parameter, and this enlarge card here will then, if it is enlarging, then we should tween the size plus. If it's not enlarging, we should tween the size minus to its original width and height, original x and y. So this is what enlarging does. It tweens actually the size, the y position, the rotation and stuff like that. It tweens it to a certain point, and if it stops enlarging, it tweens it back to its original point. So that's why on cards we have instance variables called original width, original height, original y, original rotation. So we can turn them back and put them back at the same place where they were just before the enlargement. So the parameter here 0 means we should make them all smaller, and there is this except parameter. We make them all smaller except the card we are hovering over. And we are enlarging the card we are hovering over. That's what we do here. And we do exactly the vice versa. We enlarge all cards with parameter 0 whenever we are not hovering over cards. And the card is enlarged and the current deck is on the table. We're not executing and it's not the card being dragged. Then what we do is we decrease the size again, and we call a function called rearrange cards. This is actually a very important function that actually rearranges the cards like they are here in an arc, where all the cards are nicely visible on top of each other in like a fashion that's nicely that makes them nicely visible here. This is done in the rearrange cards function, and it's actually a topic of another video in the series. So whenever we do that, we make them smaller again, and we arrange the cards. So this is the hovering logic. The dragging and the dropping logic is a bit more complicated, and we have of course 3 parts in this logic where we start a dragging operation while we are dragging something, and we stop the dragging information. So when we start the dragging information of a card which current deck equals t, So we're dragging a card on the table. What we do is first we move it to the top of the layer, so it becomes the topmost card the user is going to see. And we also set the sign behavior to disabled. So as you see, these cards move up and down a little bit. They're a little bit wiggly. Whenever we hover over that wiggle movement stops. And that happens because the sign movement here is disabled. So we set the size of that card to its original height and width to times 1.2. And then we set the drag it UID and we disable the hinting. So what happens here is, let's see, whenever we start, we don't see hints anymore. So we disable the hinting. The size becomes a little bit larger. You can see that, larger than the other cards. And we can drag it around. So this is what happens. When we drop, we enable the hinting again. And we disable the highlight of all of the enemies. So this works actually a bit in the same way as Enlarge cards, where we have highlight enemies, and there's a parameter that says highlight yes or no, 0 being not highlighting, 1 being highlighting. So whenever there was a highlighting for some reason, it's disabled. And then we need to check if the Y of the cards is smaller than the B box bottom. So that means that whenever we are over the B box, the swiper interface here. So let's see that swiper interface, the swiper logic. It should be here somewhere. This red part is the card swiper. So that means that whenever we're dragging and we're dragging over the swiper here, that means we can do something. If you're dragging too low, that means you've really not intended to do something. You're just picking up the card by accident, for example. And when we drop it, when it's not over this card swiper sprite, it just goes back into place. That's what happens there. So you can see that if it's not over the card swiper, then we just no longer highlight the card and we rearrange the cards again. And after the drag drop, of course, as the very last thing, we're going to set the drag it UID back to 0 because nothing is being dragged anymore. But inside the logic where we are over the card swiper, there's a distinction between two things. Either the cards target an enemy, either they don't. So this is targeting an enemy, this is not targeting an enemy. When is it something targeting an enemy? For example, this bargain here will not target an enemy. So we can drag it, and anywhere we drag it on the swiper, it becomes active and we can let it go. But some are targeted at the enemy, like this one, the serpent. So if we drag it somewhere, which is somewhere over the swiper, but not over an enemy, you cannot let it go. It becomes rearranged again. But if you hover over an enemy, it will actually indicate that enemy to be attacked. And then it will execute that card. So this is a instance variable of a card, which is configured to be targeting an enemy, yes or no. So when it's not targeting an enemy, we can put away the card and we can use that card. Just as simple as that. If it is targeting an enemy, then what we want to do is when we are overlapping an enemy hoverer, and the enemy hoverer is what you saw here, is that white thing here, that white thing that moves. This is an enemy hoverer. And that enemy hoverer, when we're overlapping that, we pick the enemy which is linked to the enemy hoverer. So the enemy hoverer here, you can see that this has a instance variable called enemy UID. Whenever that is created, this enemy hoverer, we also set the enemy UID instance variable of the enemy hoverer to the UID of that enemy. So we can pick the enemy whenever we're hovering over the enemy hoverer. So if that is the case, and the enemy still has a health, so that shouldn't work, of course, if the enemy is already dead on the ground. So that's why we check here if the enemy still has health. Then we have to check if the card needs to be removed after the use. If so, we're going to remove it from the deck. The Q command, C remove from deck, is XUN commands to remove it from the deck. And if it does not need to be removed, we just put it away on the right deck. And then we use the card. So if it's not over an enemy, or we can't pick the enemy, we just rearrange the cards. If it's not overlapping something, we rearrange the cards. And if it's not targeting anything, or it's wrongly configured, we just unhighlight all of the cards and rearrange the cards again. So that's it. So we effectively check all this logic here. And then when we are tracking a card that is on the table and we are not targeting an enemy, we should check if we're over a swiper. And if we're over a swiper, we're going to highlight that card. Highlighting means that there is this bluish thing around it. Like that. This is a highlight, this bluish thing. So that's what we call here, highlight card. Else we don't highlight the card. You can see the parameter here, 1 or 0. And if we are targeting an enemy, and we are over the swiper, and we are overlapping an enemy hoverer, then we'll select the enemy by that enemy hoverer, just like we did there on the drag drop. We will highlight that enemy, meaning that we will show the enemy hoverer, only if it still has health, not if it's dead, of course. Otherwise, we will no longer hide all of the enemies, and we no longer highlight the card. That's it. So that's actually pretty simple logic, a bit complicated because there's a lot of things going on, but in essence not too difficult to encompass a logic where we can drag cards around, have them highlighted, have them dropped on the interface over an enemy or not over an enemy. That's how it works. So I hope you learned something. As always, please like and subscribe, and if you want the full source code of the game, please make sure to support me on my Patreon page. The links are in the description. Thank you.